Okay, glad to see all of you. The strange-looking creature on the screen is a character that the British invented for the London Olympics. I think they call him Wenham, W-E-N-H-A-M, Wenham, get it? And Wenham, win the games, that's it. If I have to explain it, it's not much fun, okay. Ann and I feel very fortunate to be here today. We barely got in time, and we've missed some things, of course, and we're sorry about that. But on Tuesday, we were in Vegas. Now, don't get alarmed. We didn't spend enough time there to even put a nickel in a slot machine. So, actually, what happened, Ann's sister got in a terrible automobile accident. A young teenager was texting, how unusual is that, and ran into her car and totaled it, and she ended up in the hospital having to have a heart what do you call it when they bypass your heart and do something else with it? I can't remember. I guess they reconnected eventually. But her car was destroyed, and so she had a friend who lived in Yuma, Arizona, who was willing to almost donate a beautiful car. But the only problem was this lady's a little older than me, and she wasn't about to drive back to Nashville, so we had to find somebody to drive the car back. So Ann and I volunteered. Whether that was a good idea or not, I don't know. So it was okay going out on a plane, and then, of course, we drove down to Yuma, which is roughly 4 or 5 hours from Las Vegas. An interesting drive. The California roads are terrible, by the way. Then we had to go back from Yuma to Nashville, so that was the fun part. Okay. So we've been through the desert and wherever. I would say Texas drivers are probably even crazier and goofier, in my opinion, than Tennessee drivers, and that's going a long way. Okay. Just want to fill you in on that, all right. So we've had an interesting week, but praise the Lord, we're back, we're alive. We survived all the weirdness out there on the highways. So. Well, this week I was sad to learn that the last of the Von Trapp singers passed away. This was not the mother, but she had the same name, Maria. Maria Von Trapp was the second youngest sister, and she's 99 years old, so that's pretty good. I couldn't help but think, I've always been fascinated with the Von Trapp story. Of course, the movie altered it a little, as you know, as they always do, but after they got married, the Baron and Maria, they took a honeymoon trip to Munich, and guess who they ran into in a cafe in Munich? Adolf Hitler, of all people. Can you believe that? He was actually there in the cafe in Munich, Germany, when they were on a honeymoon. So they would later have some encounters, as you know. But did you, all of you, see The Sound of Music at one point or another? This is a more mature crowd here in some ways, so I would assume yes, right? What was your favorite song? I like What's the Problem with Maria or something. But you know, they could reframe that and say Maria's an asset to the Abbey. You know, they could have reframed it. Nah, that's okay. The problem with Maria is something or another, but she won't listen, right? So, did that happen? People don't listen, right? What's your favorite song? Well, sing. Would you like to sing a verse for us? Yeah. Never mind. I like The Lonely Goat Herd. I like that line there where it says, from the lonely goat herd's throat was heard, or something. It's yodel. So you want to, Larry, sing a little? Larry's got a lot of attention today. You want to yodel for us a little? No thanks, he said. I like Climb Every Mountain. That's kind of one of my favorites, you know. Climb every, don't worry, I won't sing it. Okay, but I'm tempted to try. Not tempted and tried, but tempted to try, okay.
You could hum it, Bob.
What's that? What's your?
Aren't you a good hummer?
You want to sing a line or two?
You.
No, me. You really want to suffer, don't you? Okay. You have a self-destructive need. What? I have an embarrassing moment or two. I don't want to even think about Leontine Price singing "Oh Mia Bambino Cara" and me joining in. That was not appreciated by the people around us by any means, and I don't blame them. I would have killed me if it had been me. Okay, everybody's welcome. Now, what I want to do is we're sort of winding James down. I want to spend just a few minutes looking, before we do the final closeout, looking at some of the themes in James, because I was, on the way back, this is kind of what I was thinking about in the car, you know. Maybe I should have been paying attention, you know, to driving, but in my mind I'm thinking, you know what? And so some things kind of struck me about James that I wanted just to share with you today briefly. And so remember, James is really Jacob, but we call him James, as he's called in Spanish, Santiago, you know, San Diego is James. So names flip around in different languages. He probably wouldn't answer to James if you were to say, hey James, come over here, I want to talk to you. He would answer to Jacob, or Jacobos, of course. And now the thing about him is that we understand from all ancient writings and literature that he's the physical brother of Jesus. And so that's kind of one of the reasons I like James. I like what he has to say. And I think there's a lot of great reasons to like him. So number one, there's some humility here. He comes at it not from the angle of a know-it-all, but from somebody who's learned by experience and by prayer and by being in touch with his brother. Some pretty valuable ideas for us. Second thing, James has really great views of God. And we miss that sometimes. We're thinking it's a little tract on activism, but it isn't that. It's all sort of God-generated possibilities in James, and I like that. And the value of wisdom. So some people have said it's the only New Testament wisdom book we have, and that may be true. I don't know. Wisdom literature is a special genre, as you all know. I suppose if someone said, well, why is wisdom literature really all about? Basically reducing the number of fools in the world, if possible. So, I don't know. Maybe they're like Maria, you know, what do you do with... And finally, there are some cautions that I take seriously, or if you want to call them warnings. To me, there are some things you need to look out for. You need to be on the alert. For instance, I go down the road of life, I appreciate the signs that say, bridge out ahead. You know, I definitely am glad they put the sign up. You know. So those things are very helpful. Now, so in moving on these ideas, there's a lack of ego tripping in James. There's a lacking of name dropping. Well, let's see if I can illustrate what I mean. Would you tell me if you recognize, let's put it this way. Suppose a face that I'm going to put on here was in your family, okay? Would you talk about it? And would you drop the name of this individual when you talk to people? Let's say you're at, name a restaurant, somebody that you like. Nobody likes any restaurants. Okay. What was that? Okay. Say you're there and you're talking to someone, and this person is a relative of yours, okay? Would you mention that in the conversation? You know, would you claim any kinship, okay? You with me on this? All right, let's see. Number one, would you claim kinship here? Any of you? Would you let that drop if she were your relative? Does anybody not know who this is? Who is this? Which one? Which number? 2. Well, 1 would not be. Yeah, I doubt it. Well, what about if this person were a relative of yours? Would you drop that name in conversation? Who is this? Anybody? Alice Cooper. How is it you know these things? Now, this is the way we smoke out the people we need to check out, okay? Would you let that drop in conversation at the restaurant? Well, Alice Cooper, my uncle, said the other day, something very wise. What about this guy? Yes. Will any of you claim him if he was in your family? You wouldn't? You wouldn't? C.S. Lewis. All right, we got you on that one. C.S. Lewis. You'd certainly claim him. I mean, wouldn't you? Well, as my great uncle C.S. Lewis said in the Narnia Chronicles, I would do that. I would drop that name. I really would, yeah. Well, okay, let's look at some more. What about this guy? Would you admit? Huh? Would you admit to his being your relative anyway? Some of you would. Oh, so we got a political thing here, huh? The Democrats say, no, there's no way. If he's my relative, I'd be embarrassed, right? Republicans, of course, would definitely go. No, you'd probably admit. Well, as my great grandfather's second cousin, Ronald Reagan, used to say, really, you're related to Ronald Reagan? Wow. What about this guy? Now, is he a little obscure? Yes. Yes. All right. Who is this? Huh? That's a rich uncle, and you won't even know you love him. What's his name, anybody? Warren Buffett. Right. You know him. I've heard you drop his name in conversation. Your first cousin, right? What about this guy? A girl. Ah, I got you now. Okay. This will have to go back away. You think she's pretty? Not your kind? Is not your kind? I'm talking to you. Is she your kind? Is that this girl? Is she your kind? Would you date her? Yeah. You would? Who is this?
Joan of Arc.
No. Lucretia Borgia. Have some coffee. What did Lucretia Borgia do better than anybody else? Poison men. She was the world's great poisoner. Ah, you remember, right? Lucretia Borgia. Larry, you knew her well, didn't you, back in another life? Huh? You offer for your little wine, and that's how things begin to go downhill, right? Now, she's a great poisoner. You definitely probably wouldn't. She also had this thing going with Pope Alexander VI, but like Russ said today, we'll talk about that another time. So here we have Jacob. Now, if your brother was Jesus, don't you think you'd let it drop once in a while? Well, when we were kids, I remember Jesus said to me once, Jacob, I'm disappointed in you. I just thought of that line again from never makes a mention of that. I would, wouldn't you? You guys, let me tell you who's talking to you here. It's the brother of the Lord, okay? L-O-R-D, get it? Jesus. I'm telling you, not a mention. So the fact that he doesn't do any name dropping is to me quite extraordinary, because I have a temptation to, well, even if you just see somebody from a distance, is that Elvis? You know, when I went through Vegas, I was sure I saw him 3 times. But no. Notice what he says of himself. Yaakov, a slave of God and the Lord Yeshua the Messiah. That is, doesn't say my brother, Yeshua, Jesus, but rather a slave, a servant. And that's kind of the way he looks at himself. He's there to serve. So he started saying, hey, I'm not any more important than anybody. Blood relative. You know, even John said what? Not by blood. Not by blood, but by the power of God. So I like that. Okay, but then I really love his views of God. I think he's got great views of God, and I'm sure you're all familiar with many of these, but we're running by. First of all, for James, God is the epitome of generosity. But not only is he the epitome of generosity, and that consistently emerges through James, and you can read that early on. Let him ask God who gives to all. And then he makes a pretty good statement about generosity, because sometimes people are generous, but they're also, how shall I say, they're grudging about it. You know, I was when I first started in ministry many years ago, I was at a church, and our policy of benevolence was to give to every other person. To give to every other person. And the reason was, a person would come in and they would say, hey, just got in here from Saskatchewan, I have 5 kids in the car, we need some milk. Everybody's out of milk and we need milk, so could you give us some money? And we learned that was not the greatest idea in the world. So we give the guy money, and then later, hey, Joe Blow with Saskatchewan play was in here in the liquor store buying some liquor the other day. I guess he needed a little milk for his kids, yeah. So we feel so bad about that. The next guy would come in and have a legitimate need. We say, no way, you know, you're not going to take advantage of us. Then we feel so guilty we'd help the next guy no matter. So that wasn't a good policy, you know. That was not a good policy. But God's not like that. He's not saying, I'm helping every other person, you know, or I don't feel good about you. You don't look real genuine to me. And I think you're probably a crook trying to take advantage of me. The Bible says, James said, God gives to all ungrudgingly, which means he doesn't really chew you out if you ask, if you have a need. It doesn't like Take a number. Imagine if you were praying and you heard an angelic voice that said, okay, take a number. 7,432 million, well, I'll never. It's kind of like you're welcome. I mean, that's a big thing if you think about it. Okay, so God gives ungraciously, but He's gracious. That means that He wants this relationship with us. James says, I like this translation in the Common English Version. He wanted us to be His own special people, and so He sent the true message, the word of truth, to give us new birth. And the purpose of the word of truth was not to straighten us out, but to introduce us to right ideas about God and about ourselves and about salvation. So God is gracious to share His good news. And so this is a really great views of God that James has. But one I like particularly is this: God is dependable in a kind of powerful way. It's not like you hear all these storms going on. People say, well, they lost power. 100 million people lost power in Pennsylvania. And you think, wow, the whole lifestyle changes when you lose power, right? You don't have any heat. You don't have any TV. Maybe you're better off. But you've got to sort of go back to a simpler way of living in a way. Well, suppose you run out of power in your life. Well, you can't run that on a generator, although people try. You know, these little boats, these little boats are nice. Have you ever been in one? They have a pedal. A pedal. I would not recommend trying to cross the Atlantic in one of these, you know. But some people are trying to live their lives like that, like they have these little bitty boats that run on their own power. And they wonder why they're not getting anywhere, and what they really need is what? God's power, obviously. So the graciousness of God and the power of God is able to move into a life and to move that individual in directions and in lifestyles that are really what they need to be into. So James has this lack of ego, which means he's humble, but he also recognizes that we need to have some right ideas about God. Now, I believe this. I've said this here many times. If you see something going wrong spiritually in some church or something, the idea behind it probably is a very wrong idea about God. You take, an extreme view of this church in Topeka, Kansas. They obviously have a very, very distorted picture of God. And it comes out in their lives and in their messages and so forth. With all due respect to this poor gentleman who believes religion consists of mangling rattlesnakes in front of an audience and paid with his life for it, and yet his son is going to carry on. And I'd like to get that boy and talk to him and say, I think you're misreading Mark 16 just a little bit. It also mentions poison. Have you tried that lately? Why don't you get up in front and drink some cyanide in front of the congregation? They leave that part out because it's not dramatic, you see. I mean, a snake, that's dramatic. It might get loose and come at you, right? Boy, you might go to the service just because you're a thrill seeker. Well, maybe not, but on the other hand, it is kind of weird, really. This morning there was a cartoon about two different churches. One had a church bazaar, and another one said Bizarre Church. And Bizarre Church had a sign out that said, we'll handle snakes tonight. Well, I'm not going anywhere near that place. I don't know about you. One of those things might get loose, come crawl up your pants leg or something. So we need to get out of these little bitty boats, and James talks about having God dependable. There's no shadow cast by turning, as an astronomical term, and it means that you can depend on God to be predictable and certain, not uncertain and inflexible. James then moves into an area that he talks a lot about because people want to know, well, how can I make right choices? How can I do the right thing? How can I live the right kind of life? And so he introduces a concept that's been around a long, long time in the Bible, wisdom. Of course, you see wisdom literature in the Hebrew Scriptures, right? Job. Name any more? Proverbs. Is there any other? Ecclesiastes. How are you doing? Doing okay? There's some Psalms that are wisdom Psalms, etc. So what is wisdom about? Well, we're not only reducing the number of fools in the world, but also giving you the background, the experience that you need to make the right decisions. Because decisions are going to determine where you are in life, as you all know. Wrong decision, you're down the drain. We're going through Dallas-Fort Worth. This is not something I recommend. On Route 30, okay. A guy on a motorcycle, and apparently they don't have a helmet law there, so you get killed faster, I guess, when you have a wreck. And I just hate to be a paramedic in that town This guy, you know, you see a guy going through traffic 100 miles an hour and the traffic's going 60. You have to wonder what's going on inside their skull, if there is anything between their ears, and if it's working, okay. But we need wisdom not to do stupid things like that and hurt other people. So what's the value of wisdom? James talked quite a bit about this, by the way. Of course, wisdom is our wonderful term, Sophia. Sophia, if you name your little kid Sophia, you name her wisdom. And we all have these huge decisions to make. And it goes all the way from just unbelievably important things like, and you ever notice that in your life you make 5 or 6 of the most incredible decisions when you're the least mature? Now, whether you're going to accept the Lord or not, who you're going to date and marry, whether you're going to go to college or study or party, and how you're going to pay back student loan, if you intend to, and what are you going to do about a livelihood. And you're trying to make all those super important decisions at the time in your life where you have the least wisdom going for you. And that's why it's not always a bad idea to listen to Dad and Mom sometimes. What was it Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, said one time that when he was 14 or 15, his father was the absolute stupidest person on the planet. And so he went out in the world, you know, and he got a job on a ship and up and down the Mississippi, and he came back to visit. He said, I was impressed, so incredibly impressed by how much my father had learned in 5 years. Duh. So, wisdom needed. But there's some cautions. Now, the thing about, you know, when we throw up the caution flag, and I say, oh, what do we say when you say, road work ahead, and you're driving down the interstate, making good time? You said, road work ahead, and what's the first thing pops in your head? Oh, no, not again. Well, Arkansas ever going to get enough money to fix these roads? And we got to Memphis. Is Tennessee never going to get enough money to fix these roads? The only state. Well, we went to 2 states where everything was really cool and there was no problems and the roads are all, and that was Arizona and, what's the next one? New Mexico, right? Texas began to have problems. By the time we got in Arkansas, it was hopeless. Okay. Now, so there's caution flags everywhere. Slow down, watch out, you know, look up at the sky, right lane closed, left lane closed. Well, you know, you regret that it's there, but in a way you need to know these things. Well, most people think of cautions. What do they think of? They think of something like this, I suppose. Now, this is how you took it when you were a kid, right? I remember this very well. Line up to take it. You got to have your vitamin D, right? How many of you had to take this stuff when you were kids? Any of you ever take castor oil? Wasn't that great? It was a very moving experience, wasn't it? But you know, in a way, we understand that some things are a little difficult, and some teachers you take are really hard, but later you think, hey, I learned a lot from that person. So James is going to kind of introduce us to the idea that trials and result in experience, and experience connected with wisdom equals a pretty good lifestyle overall. Now, he's going to be a huge theme with him, okay. So, first he starts off with this incredible idea about being happy or joyful when you're in the middle of trials. Well, that just doesn't make any sense, we think. But he must be talking about the way you frame things in a way. You know, if you frame a problem, now as Elvis said, the problem with Maria, and they sang this song, what the problem they said, she's a will-o'-the-wisp. And one nun says, a clown. What else? But then one said, Maria makes me laugh. How valuable is that? That's an asset, right? How many things can make you laugh? It's kind of like the old saying, you know, anything can make you look. Oh, how did that thing get in here? Made you look. I know you were just that way, you rascal. With Rodney, that does not work. You can say anything can make you look, but what can make you see? Well, James is saying a lot of things can make you look, but I can help you see. I can give you the wisdom you need to cope with some of these problems. So if you reframe this as what's God trying to teach me here, it's not a pleasant, but it may yield better results when you reframe it. And James is trying to help us to do that. But he said, now here's what you really need to watch out for, because most of the things that are going to happen to you will end up being your own fault. Not always. Not always. Well, I remember talking to a young man in the hospital once who had been in a wreck. And I said, well, what happened? He said, I was dogging it. I'll just be honest with you. I was just dogging it out there on the highway. I was speeding. I was careless, you know. Not many people will admit that, you know. And so he was in there not because some mean old person ran over him, but because he was just being foolish. And so you have a desire to be powerful, and so you want to go faster than the next guy. And James says that sin gets a good hold on you, it'll kill you, okay. But then he puts a positive spin on trials and tries to get us to reframe the way we look at them. So we went through this life and never had a single trial, never had a single temptation, never had a single problem. What kind of person would we be? You'd certainly be someone would no one would ever go to you and ask for advice, because you don't have any experience. I don't mean this disrespectfully, but I always wondered how, with all respect now, a Roman Catholic priest could give you advice on raising children. I mean, you know, I never really understood. Well, maybe there's something going on there I don't know about. But you know, if you can be tempted, it means you're spiritually alive, James says. You know, if you're having a struggle, and we know that it's not a temptation for a lot of people. One of the common little stories I use is if somebody wants to steal your car and they walk by and see the key in it, that's not a temptation. That's an opportunity. And if you never struggle with something, it means you're just not spiritually alive at all. You know, if everything's just an opportunity for you and not a struggle to do this or not, what? I should pray about this. Because there are going to be a lot of things in life that seem morally neutral, but when you think through them, may not be. I think the next thing about it is you're trying to do what's right, and that's why you're having a struggle. You know, if you just went wherever they pushed you, you never like a vein. You know, if you're like a wind vane, you know, you're just going to go wherever the wind blows. Or someone said, "Are you a thermometer or thermostat?" That's pretty good too. Now I'm sure you've all heard that, but thermometers only reflect the atmosphere. Well, if it's 80 in here, the thermostat tries to control it a little bit. If it needs to be cooler, it'll put some work into it and try to make it cooler. So it's kind of like James is saying, I believe, with if you go through these experiences with God, then you're going to find you're able to actually get the right done more often than not. And boy, you don't really learn much the other way. Like C.S. Lewis, who we put his face up earlier, said, experience is the best teacher, but it's the hardest one you'll ever have. And boy, I'll tell you, and I know everybody here can tell me, if we had time to sit down and talk, you could tell me what I learned from this terrible experience that I went through here, there, or otherwise, about people, about whatever. We don't ask for these things. We don't say, Lord, please send me a trying experience today. You're worse than that person on the 100-mile-an-hour motorcycle if you're praying that kind of prayer. You better check that a little bit. Now, you just pray the Lord uses a little wisdom in answering that prayer with you. But they do, when they come our way, we can be defeated by them. And what's the old saying? The same sun that melts butter will turn clay into adobe, you know. So it's the same sun, but the same experience can kill some people and ruin them, but others it can make tougher. Okay. Thank you, James. So trials give us experience. But then James raises another question, and he raises the question of doubt. And he says it will erode your faith. Now, I don't think that James is talking about the sort of honest doubt, you know, that we all have, where we're struggling with spiritual concepts and realities. But the sort of doubt that emerges when you try to do a spiritual life and a secular life with the same force in each one. And you see the value of the spiritual life, but you just don't see it worth all your energy or time. And so you try to put about equal time or more into the secular life. And that's what James, he calls it a double-mindedness. Or literally the Greek is daisuke, two-souled individual. So that's what he means by doubt, not so much the struggle that you may have with some honest concerns about the problems and the atrocities of the world, the Holocaust, things like that may certainly do that. And children's illness, things of that bear deeply upon us, but then We wrestle through that, but it's not the same as if we're trying to serve the world and serve the Lord with equal force. That's the kind of doubt James is talking about. So that's going to erode your faith. Now, then James goes on then to say to us that our lives will be so much better if we learn to avoid certain ways we treat people. And this is real important with James, and so he gets into the subject of loving your neighbor. And he develops that by saying, one of the things that it's going to do is to keep you from being prejudiced against people and stereotyping people. This is very, very strong in James. And the Lord is deeply offended by that elitism and particularism, and showing that, some people are more valuable to you. So he says, my brothers, then don't have this with the receiving of faces. Okay. That leads to prejudice. Now, of all the things in the Bible that says not to do something, it's amazing that we find that prejudice bothers God about as much as anything. Prejudice bothers God, really bothers God. So it's a heavy thou shalt not. And then James moves over into the field, and this is all connected together about getting along and loving our neighbor, and that's working on our communication. And I brought you information that shows that communication is the single most vital thing to help you if you intend to get along in this world with other people in any constructive way. Communication is right at the top. And when I was teaching business communication at the University of North Alabama, one of the things I discovered in my research was that in talking to human resources people, well, who are you looking for to hire? And while job skills was very important, almost first or second on every list was good communication skills. Because if you know everything in the world and you come in and you got a bad idea and you can't relate it and you can't talk to the other guy and you can't tell them your ideas and you can't share your concerns or teach anybody, you're valueless. They don't need some anchorite who's out in the Sudan desert somewhere on top of a pillar like stalactites in their company. Now, that may be okay if you live out there in the desert, but it doesn't work and it doesn't work in the family of God either, because we really need to work on our communication. Some people think they're being honest when they're only being brutal. They don't understand what communication is constructive in nature. So, moving on rapidly here, here's what James says about that. We reverse this most of the time, don't you think? We're quick to speak and slow to listen. And James says it the other way in a second. James, are you sure you got that right? But that's a really good input if you think about it. Then I think the final topic James is going to get around to, and that is the value of true riches. And we get this a little messed up too, because if we go on earlier, I noticed how many of you were more than happy to acknowledge Warren Buffett as related to you in some hopeful way. You're a rich uncle billionaire. That would be nice, but we know down deep when in our best moments that that's not really the way you determine the worth of someone. But people will just consistently believe that, won't they? Right on up to the day they're not here anymore, and finally they learn the lesson. There's something Ovid, I'm sure you all read Ovid lately, Metamorphoses, about the changes that happen in lives. And he said, young Alexander, for whom the whole world was not enough, finally in the brick-walled city of Babylon had to be content with the width of a grave. That's where Alexander ended up, in Babylon. And the whole world wasn't enough for his ambition, but he had to be content with 6 feet. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So we need to be moving on, be hearers, doers of the word, not hearers only, and move into action. And I take James' theme, as I look at it overall, as people who follow my brother, and he didn't say it that way, but people who follow the Lord are going to be there where there's pain and where there's need. We're not going to form these exclusive communities based upon our elitism. We're not going to support policies that hurt and damage people. We're never going to be a part of a church fight or church fuss. We're going to try to use our communication in ways, because all this comes from God. God who gives to us generously and will never chew you out for asking. So, I wanted to give you a little overview of James, and this is what was going through my mind as I'm trucking down the road there, somewhere around, it must have been, no, it wasn't there, that's for sure.
Over in Arkansas?
It was El Paso. Because my T-Mobile phone said, "Welcome to Mexico." That's how close I was. And I never crossed the border.
Did you take 10, 20, 30, 47? Did you go 10, 20,